Well, today I am thrilled to be chatting with Andre Henry about his new book, All the White Friends I Couldn't Keep. Hey, Andre,
Hi,
thanks for joining me.
thanks for having me.
I really enjoyed this book. I feel like it is just required reading for um, particularly white people who fancy themselves allies, which is which is something. I mean, let's dive in there if you want. You talked about that designation in the book,
hmm
and gave some advice that I thought was very good for white
hmm
people maybe giving themselves that label.
Mm. I'm gonna go ahead and just break like convention immediately and ask you why you felt like this is such a good book for white allies. I'll keep in mind though. I'll keep in mind we're
Yeah.
talking about that chapter. But when you said, I was just curious.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. I mean, first of all, I felt like the book was so full of examples and some of them from your own life, right? And from your own
hmm
relationships with white people. And there were
hmm
some of them that I read and went, "Oh gosh, that's so bad." Like, oh, these white people are being so cringy and so, out of
hmm
hand. And then there were others where I went, "Oh gosh, like I think I've done that before." You know what I'm saying? Like you really gave
yeah.
the breadth of, and you talked about that spectrum, but you really
hmm
gave the breadth of objectively bad behavior and then these like microaggressions of well-meaning
yeah.
liberal white people. And
hmm
the lens of your own personal experience made it so relatable,
hmm
um and that's what I meant.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I hear that. I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Um. So yeah, when we talk about allies, I do have a chapter. Oh, it's the white men explain things to me chapter, right? And
Yeah.
so I go through a couple of stories of white folks who consider themselves a part of the movement for
Yeah.
racial justice, and how there's some internal work that needs to happen. And it's not just with white people. I mean, right now we're talking about white people and racial justice, but as a man, there's a that I have to unlearn. When I'm in conversation, a black man,
Mm-hmm.
there are things that I have to unlearn, and work on, around internalizing the patriarchy, the way that I interact um, with women of color, black women, LGBTQ people. And the same thing kind of happens, or you see the same kind of thing in racial justice movements.
Yeah.
And it's kind of consistent throughout history that oftentimes well meaning white people will come close to the racial justice
Mm-hmm.
movement or into the racial justice movement
Mm-hmm.
without really giving much attention to the ways that they share and express the anti-black common sense
Mm-hmm.
that our society is based on. And so,
Mm-hmm.
we've seen these complaints in a recent study, 2019 study, that is literally about this dynamic about how white people enter anti-racist uh, contexts
Mm-hmm.
and end up burning out the activists of color there and the black activists that are in that space.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I appreciated you talked about that in this sort of dynamic of white people entering anti-racist spaces, but then using their proximity to black people in those spaces as this sort of calling card of look
Mm.
how anti-racist I am, as opposed to it being, you know,
Yeah, this is a common thing in just activist spaces that an organizer named Jonathan Smucker writes about in his book Hegemony How To. And he talks about how many people engage in activist activity, movement activity, whatever you want to call it, as a kind of form of fashion, right? And so,
mm-hmm.
we know that. Uh, one minute, let me close this window behind me.
No problem.
Okay, so we know that oftentimes, people with fashion, they wear certain things so they can express what type of person they are.
Yeah.
Right. So you know by looking at them. You know by looking at them, like what type of person they are.
Yes.
And so people often do this with movement stuff. And so this is why, people, they have the Black Lives Matter flag in their yard, or the, or whatever on their bumpers, or on the bumper sticker, or they're at the protest and they make sure that they take an Instagram photo. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with taking Instagram photos. But these are just some examples of how, we engage in the movement as a form of fashion sometimes.
Yeah.
And so, we see that in the movement as well, where it's like, okay, you're here because you want to be on the right side of history, or you want people to see you as someone being on the right side of history. But the internalized, but the very real, palpable sense that this society has shaped my common sense and behavior in such a way that I am harmful to other people, and I need to do something about that, right?
Yeah.
Internally. I need to take that on as my own work.
Yeah.
I feel like that is a lot rarer to see.
Yeah. It's I agree. I agree. Let me jump back to the beginning of your book. Something that you wrote that I thought was so fascinating is you said, I once believed racism was primarily an emotional attitude rooted in ignorance, irrational hatred for people based on their skin color. There was a time I believed the myth that America is a fair place where people get what they deserve. Talk about that process of moving from this idea that racism is just bad people being judgmental to the more global sense of systemic racism where you understand it to be today.
Yeah, a part of that misunderstanding, which is a very common misunderstanding, comes from the way that we're educated, right? About race and racial justice and all that. First off, I don't know about everyone else, but I grew up in Stone Mountain, Georgia, and I was a part of the County school system, and our education around race was almost zero. Like, nobody teaches us in elementary school or middle school or high school that race is a social construct and not a biological fact. Those kinds of basic things that would be helpful to know about race and racism. We don't get those lessons. And then for me, growing up in Stone Mountain and being surrounded by the ghosts of the Confederacy, and also, the monuments of the Civil Rights Movement, there's a lot of pride in being the capital city of the Civil Rights Movement and Dr. King's legacy, but there's also a lot of holding on to the Confederacy. Shoot, the Georgia flag, I don't know if it still does, but for a long time, at least as far back as I remember, had the Confederate battle emblem in it. Yeah. Right? So when you grow up in that kind of environment, that was the thing that I was taught. That racism is pretty much a thing of the past. There might be some, overt racists out there, but, it's rare. And it was always talked about as though it's this individual emotional hate. And even, I write about in the book about how I was perceiving and experiencing systemic racism, but not knowing it, and trying to name certain instances as racism, but then there were these adult white people saying, no, that doesn't count,
Totally.
all the time, right? You're playing the race.
So you're not being educated, and then you're being gaslit.
Yes, exactly. No, not educating me and then telling me, oh no, you're just imagining that, or that's not how it's defined, right? You have these, and as a child, you believe the adults in your life. You're bigger. You've been here longer than I have. I guess you're right? Yeah. And so I didn't start really breaking free from that. In the book, I say that it really starts to lift in New York, but I think it's actually starts to lift when I moved to Florida and I went to a Bible college out there, and I was experiencing some microaggressions. Like, one time I got accused of stealing my own bike while I was on campus there because the security guard felt like I didn't, quote unquote, look like a student. What does a student look like, right? And I did try to name things like that here and there. and still same kind of gaslighting. But then when I did move to New York after college, I would start naming things that happened to me. Like I write about in the book how I went to go look at an apartment. The landlord seemed really excited to rent to me when he was talking to me on the phone, but then, was I could see was visibly disappointed when he saw me in person and didn't rent the apartment to me. When I would start naming things like that in New York, people just agreed with me. People would say, "Yeah, that's
Right.
racist,"
Yeah. Yeah.
And then I started learning about. I didn't have the language for systemic racism until I was in New York, because that's, there was a church event, which I often get nervous to even talk about, my upbringing in church and all that kind of stuff. But I'm learning to also just be honest about how I came to learn some of these things. I learned about systemic racism because 3 Black women at my church felt like it was important to have an event about whiteness.
Wow.
In 2014, I think it was. It was
Yeah.
around the time that Eric Garner was killed.
Yeah.
I think so. That's 2014, 2015. There were 3 Black women in my church who said we need to have an event about whiteness, and I'd never even heard that term before, whiteness. For the first time, I was in a racial justice conversation that was looking for the root cause of racism, but wasn't looking in Black people for it.
Yeah.
Wasn't saying, because that's usually how these conversations I was used to them being had was, what's wrong with Black people to where we keep suffering so much?
Yeah.
But this conversation about whiteness was bringing up something that I had not considered before, which is the root of all this racial violence, or at the root, is that some people really believe that they're white.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's how I've taken a long time to answer this question, but that was kind of how things started beginning to lift, was being introduced to, not introduced, but someone confirming that I was not just imagine. I wasn't hallucinating about these things.
Yes. Yeah.
So from there is a line of progression from there, where all of these deaths that we watched, from 2015 to 2016, they begin to weigh more heavily than they did, when I heard about Trayvon Martin, and eventually provoking me to say, I need to learn more about this idea of systemic racism, which put me on a journey to just read voraciously about the history, really at first of the criminal justice system in America. Then I start seeing how my personal experiences are connected to a much larger story.
Yeah. That the way that you described that gaslighting, I feel is so important for people to understand. And I only understand it from my own experience, which is I have Black children. When I have talked about their treatment in certain white spaces, I've had that same, I think you're overreacting. I don't think that's what was meant. And it's just such a curious phenomenon to me, this white impulse to deny racism. It's so strong.
Yeah.
And disorienting.
Yeah, this is a huge deal, and I had no idea how relevant that chapter near the beginning of the book, I think it's chapter 2, about racial gaslighting was going to be in this age, because something that empires do throughout history is they make up stories about themselves.
Yes, narratives.
They create these narratives to frame their consolidating of power, their dominating of other nations and peoples as a positive thing, right? So, I could go down the list of, the ideology of ancient Egypt or Babylon or Rome or Assyria, the empires always have a good story to tell about themselves, and America is no different.
Yeah.
So the gaslighting is on a systemic level,
yes,
because it's in the history books, it's in the media, it's in the religion, it's in all of these different outlets, and we're seeing it again, with the book bannings and the book burnings and the
oh my gosh,
labeling all kinds of things as CRT,
yes,
that are not CRT,
yes,
and I write about this in chapter 2 as, you know, like the systemic part of it being like, I grew up in Stone Mountain, Georgia, and that is the largest Confederate monument in the country, is on the side of this huge rock. And the idea for the monument came from Klan sympathizers, Ku Klux Klan sympathizers. It is the site where the Ku Klux Klan was reborn, and I never heard any of that growing up. When I learned that the Ku Klux Klan came up with the idea for that statue, I think it was 2020. I think that was when I learned that.
Andre, I grew up in Florida. We drove by Stone Mountain multiple times a year.
Mm-hmm.
I learned about this reading your book.
Right. Right. Like I knew it was racist. I knew it was racist, but I didn't know it was like the Klan. Yeah. Like I didn't know it was the idea of Klan sympathizers, and I didn't know that the original, idea for this monument was not to have the 3 Confederate generals, but to have just a parade of Klansmen behind Robert E. Lee on the side of that rock, and that the same person who did that carving also did Mount Rushmore. So I didn't know all these things, right? This is a part of what I'm calling the systemic gaslighting, is that, we had organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy who campaigned, pushed for a revisionist history to be taught in Southern schools about the reason that the Civil War was fought and all this kind of stuff. So anyway, the gaslighting is very real on a personal and systemic level. Yeah. And it's taught throughout it's happening, or it has happened throughout the whole white world, which I write about, how, we see this in school curriculums in Europe. A lot of the great nations of Europe don't want to talk about how their wealth was built and the colonies that they had in the Caribbean and Africa or South America or wherever. And it's continuing to happen right now, with all of these big lies.
People are going to extremes to silence.
Oh yeah, people don't want to talk about this history. They don't want to face this truth. And it's incredibly dangerous and concerning. So like I said, I had no idea how relevant that chapter alone was going to be to this moment.
Yeah. Another, you talked about one instance of gaslighting with a family that you were really close to, and that part broke my heart. Yeah. But one of the ways that they attempted to sort of silence your voice was they said, we're not talking about politics. Yeah. And then they put race under that umbrella. And that to me was so relatable, because I feel like I see so many people doing that. It's like, we don't want to talk about politics, so you can't now talk about your lived experience.
Right. And man, that was a really difficult chapter to write, not just because of, reliving the feeling of not feeling like I could be close to these people anymore, but because, I really was trying to connect the dots between like this desire to, because we're eating lunch, right? And they're saying like no political discussion at the table, and I'm trying to connect that idea that we just want to live comfortably and consume whatever goods that we have with this kind of historic dynamic that has existed. Like, and this ties back to something you mentioned earlier, you pointed out earlier, is like we talk about racism as though it's just this personal thing, this emotional thing, without understanding that racism has always been about power, and it's always been connected to the production and consumption of goods, right? It's always been, or maybe I shouldn't say always, but the racism that we know today has always been,
its roots are in that, for sure.
Its roots are in capitalism, right? And so here is a family saying, we don't want to hear about the lived experience of racialized, marginalized people, so that we can sit comfortably and enjoy our tacos, right?
Yes.
Which is not exactly the same, but I feel like it is on the same trajectory as their predecessor centuries ago, saying like, we just want to sip tea. We
Yeah.
don't want to talk
Yeah.
about, you know, the people, the money that is generated to
Hmm.
buy these goods and consume them
Hmm.
from black labor, you know, and not just black
Yeah.
labor, but black captive labor, you know, the violence of enslavement.
I loved this quote from the book. I wrote this down. To the privileged, peace means keeping a safe distance from the cries of the oppressed.
Oh yeah, for sure, absolutely. You know, and I think in that same area is where I'm talking about, like when, you know, when we're talking about privilege, those who are on that side of it have a hard time distinguishing between their personal comfort and actual social peace, right? Because they're
Yes.
saying, well, I'm at peace, I feel fine, right? And
Yeah.
that was the attitude that I got a lot from white people when I was in these conversations, was like,
Mhm.
well, because they're not experiencing it and they don't see it, then they conclude that it doesn't exist, right?
Yes.
And they weren't bothered by it until you started talking about it. Therefore, you're disturbing the peace,
Yeah.
not realizing that, like, the people who are experiencing these injustices or these microaggressions or this violence, like, they are not at peace. You know.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Something I had a little light bulb about what just now was this dynamic between white people saying we don't want to talk about politics and putting race under the political umbrella when it's
Mm.
uncomfortable,
Mm-hmm.
but then denying that racism is systemic. Like, what a weird
Oh yeah, for
mental
sure.
gymnastic.
Absolutely. And that's the thing where I'm just like, white supremacy or anti-blackness, you know, is a bad faith endeavor to begin with,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because it's not about truth,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
It's it's about preserving the power dynamics of race.
Mm-hmm.
It's about keeping white people comfortable, you
Mm-hmm.
know. And
Yeah.
so whenever it's just like what we saw with like evangelicals, which I was a part of the evangelical church for a long time, you know.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But it's like when it was convenient, you know, they held all of these values about morality and
Right.
sexual integrity and all this kind of stuff. But then, you know, when Donald Trump is running for the election and that Access Hollywood tape came out, I think that's
Yeah.
Access Hollywood,
Yeah.
you know, oh, all of a sudden, like, they don't care about that anymore. Family value. I mean, thinking about how they talked about President Clinton and really believed that President Clinton
Yeah.
did not deserve to be president anymore.
Because of his moral immorality.
Exactly. But it
Mm-hmm.
didn't matter what Donald Trump said or did,
Yeah.
because at the end of the day, what's really important is preserving the racial hierarchy,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so, yeah, I mean, we see these kinds of contradictions all the time when we start interrogating it, because it is a bad faith endeavor to begin with.
Yeah. You mentioned you came out of, evangelical faith space, as did
Mm-hmm.
I. And
Yeah,
you mentioned in the book that, there are some people who use a bastardized Christian theology as like a pillar or a way to support white supremacy.
for
Talk
sure.
about that more.
I mean, well, there's no way, I think, to have like a complete conversation about
I
racism and
know.
racial justice and all that kind of stuff without talking about the role of the church,
Yeah.
because, you know, for so long, excuse me, for so long, like, you know, the church has just been deeply involved in the
Mm-hmm.
construction and preservation of these systems of racial violence.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we can go all the way back to the 1400s with the Pope, you know, writing, giving a permission slip to
Mm-hmm.
colonizers to go in to indigenous land, enslave, rob, kill
Mm-hmm.
indigenous people in the name of Jesus, or on the basis that they are not Christian and so therefore they don't deserve to be treated with
Yeah.
respect, or whether that's respect for their actual bodies or for their culture, for their religion, for their spiritual traditions, for their societies, you know. Um, and I would say, you know, in my experience, or from my vantage point, it seems like that has been the most popular version of Christianity in the world.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
that is the Christianity that most people know.
Yeah.
Um, and I feel like, you know, Christianity has been used for a long time to convince oppressed people not to fight for their rights, not to fight for their freedom.
Yeah.
which is what Frederick Douglass said, in
Hmm.
one of his speeches. He said, he felt there was a time when he felt like if he would have run away from the work camp that he was enslaved on, that the wrath of God would follow him. You know,
Hmm.
so
Hmm.
that is powerful, to
Yeah.
think about. It's been a very powerful tool for that, and I feel like that is what people were trying to do to me, is tell me
Hmm.
that you know racism is not a priority to God, which is a direct quote,
Hmm.
or
You're being divisive if you're
yeah,
talking
it's not a
about
part.
it.
It's not a part of the gospel.
Hmm.
Jesus didn't lead any protests. You name it.
Hmm.
People are trying to use this faith
Yeah.
to tell me that I'm sinning.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I'm sinning by telling the truth.
Yeah.
I'm sinning for trying to organize, or
Yeah.
protesting, and all these kinds of things.
Yeah. Yeah. And I appreciated how you talked about it, about that in the book, and just that reality of this being another aspect of the gaslighting.
Mm-hmm.
God is in control. You talked
Oh
about
yeah,
that narrative of like, well, we shouldn't fight. We'll just sit back and like,
yeah, yeah. We'll just sit back and let it happen, and it's like, okay, well, the Christians who are in support of white supremacy don't ever sit back and say, we'll just let God make sure that we stay on top as
that's
white
right.
people, you
Right.
know,
They're
right?
working.
Right, exactly. They're always working,
Yeah.
you know. And we could even bring this further, because a lot of white people that are against racial justice movements are decidedly
Hmm.
pro-life, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
About reproductive rights and all
Right.
that. And
Singularly pro-life.
yeah, and they don't say, well, God is
Yeah.
on the throne. God will make sure that no more abortions happen.
Oh,
Right?
that's such a good point,
They're more
right?
than
Like
they're
we're gonna be activists in that
Yeah,
lane.
they're more than willing to be
Yeah,
politically active, stand on government building steps with red tape over their
totally.
mouths,
You're so
or
right. Yeah.
telling people who to vote for and how to vote and all sort of
Hmm.
kind of stuff. They're totally willing to
Yes.
become activists in that sense, because they feel like what they believe about the 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 right to life
Hmm.
of the unborn, warrants
Yeah.
their participation in the political process in this way, you know.
Yeah.
But they can't extend that, or not. They can't. They won't. They
They won't.
refuse to extend
Yeah.
that same logic, you know, to people who are fighting, people who are not in the womb, who are actually experiencing the
Living,
violence.
breathing,
Oh
experiencing
yeah,
today.
yeah, living within all of this violence.
That is an epiphany for me. Let me tell you, I just have not made that connection because I grew up in the evangelical church and we did go on pro-life marches as a kid.
Oh yeah, absolutely,
A hundred
absolutely.
percent. I held signs. It's so cringy in
Oh yeah,
retrospect. Held signs, and yet I'm sure that same church is not marching for racial justice.
yeah. What I see right now is like Christians who are totally fine being activists against CRT, against
Yeah.
critical race theory. Like they,
Yeah.
I see people who are willing to, start entire blogs and tweet every
That's
day
right.
about it and hold conferences about it
Yeah.
and try to rally people to go to school board meetings and all this other kind of stuff. They're totally fine doing that, right?
Yeah.
Just 4 years ago, 5 years ago, 2 years ago, these same people were
Hmm.
against people marching in the streets after
Right.
the death of Philando Castile,
Yeah.
or Sandra Bland or George
Uh-huh.
Floyd. You
Hmm.
know,
Or taking a knee, God forbid.
right? Exactly, exactly. It's the same people.
Yeah, it is the same people.
It's
It's
some
so
of the same
true.
people anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another part of your book that I really appreciated is you talked about this Heineken ad from a few years ago, and I remember it, right? And it was like they were just sitting people down, like the climate change denier and the climate change
Mm,
activist, and if we can sit them down with a beer, with of course their branded beer, that people are really just the same, and they can just have conversations, and we can all get to peace. And you pushed back on that, which in a way that I really appreciated. Talk about this myth of if we can all just sit down.
oh yeah, everyone want. I've said it many times that coming to the table is overrated.
Yeah. Well, and
Coming
even
to the
maybe
table,
even maybe dangerous, right? Even maybe kind of
yeah,
like self-abusive.
yeah. Because in the ad, you have a trans person and someone who and a
Mhm.
transphobic person,
Mhm.
you know, and having them sit down with each other. And you know what? Listen, like, it's their prerogative, right? Like, there's a black man out there that goes and befriends Ku Klux Klan members and tries to help them see,
Sure.
that the things that they believe about black people are lies, and that's his prerogative. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna say that he shouldn't do it. What I'm gonna say though is that people outside of these communities don't get to demand that people who are
Yes.
experiencing that kind
Yes.
of opposition, let's say harm,
Uh-huh.
that they get to
Lay
impose
themselves at the
that.
feet of
We
these
don't get they
conversations.
don't get to impose that onto people who are
Yeah.
experiencing that harm.
Yes.
And that's why I look at ads like that, and I it gives me concern, because I feel like it is reflecting a very real desire that people have in society to see people who are being harmed
Yes.
persuade the harm doers to do differently.
Yes.
And that's what I saw. I saw this the other day. The black man that I mentioned, someone posted this the other day, a picture of him. I know this story already, but they posted a picture of him the other day with his, former Klan member friend, and they're going, "This is the way that we create change." And I'm like, okay, well, you're a white guy, first off,
Yeah.
so you don't get to say how this is going to change.
Mm-hmm.
You don't. It's not just because you're white, but it's like, you're a white guy. You're not really working on this problem every day. You don't know what it feels like to be a black person, and for you to suggest that the way that this changes is for black people
Yes.
to go and befriend Klansmen, which
Right.
is, first off, dangerous on several levels for us, right? It's not
Right.
safe. It's not
Yeah.
safe physically. It's not safe emotionally or psychologically.
Mm-hmm.
For you to say that the way that this changes is for black people to go and try to befriend Klansmen and help them see the error of their ways is not only wrong, it's wildly insensitive and
Yeah.
inconsiderate. And so what I said to this person is, white people should be going and doing that.
Yes.
White
I
people should
love
be going
that.
and
Yes.
white people should be going and talking to talking to other white people,
Yeah.
especially these, especially if you're talking about people who are violently,
Yeah.
anti-black. Like, that shouldn't be black people's work to do. And then you have like all these other white people chiming in, which I try not to get into these conversations, so I just left when I saw other people chiming in on this. But it's that kind of thing. Like, when I see the ad, it's again, me coming from the church. Like, everyone talks about, Jesus' teaching to turn the other cheek, when we're talking about black people fighting for their rights.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
We don't talk about turning the other cheek when we talk about, the World Trade Center falling.
Right.
We don't talk about turning the other cheek. Shoot, white people don't talk about turning the other cheek generally when they talk about someone breaking into their house.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I'm saying?
Right.
Like, okay,
Then we need a gun.
right? Like, you're like, listen, like, you stepped on my property, you put me in danger. I have the right.
Yeah.
I have the right to shoot you,
Yeah.
right? But when we start talking about how marginalized people or oppressed people fight for their freedom, now all of a sudden everyone was mentored personally by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. So, and I'm a proponent of nonviolence.
I know
like,
you are. Right.
I'm a proponent of nonviolent struggle.
Right.
I'm just saying that
Yes.
I feel like there is this desire in white America to see black people as their little Christ.
Yeah.
And they want to see us turn the other cheek. They want to see us suffer, right? In a way, I feel like that's what they tacitly admit, is that they want to see us suffer, believing that our suffering will be redemptive for them in some way. And I'm like, you don't get to put me up on a cross so that you can one day look up and say, and he too was the son of God. I'm not doing it for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or at
But
least
man,
I don't
like,
want to. I don't want to volunteer for it.
white people love that story though. Like, I just feel like there's so many even movies of just like, the black person who defends the racist, and then they change their ways, and we feel so heartwarmed about it, when like the reality is that black person probably had to endure all kinds of abuse.
Yes, they did, and they probably, live with, live with the pain of what it was like to do that. And it's like, I mean, as someone who was raised Christian, I do believe that there is something beautiful about people being able to overcome their differences. I think that there's something beautiful about forgiveness and mercy and all that kind of stuff. What is very disturbing to me is that white people seem to believe that that is the only way,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
like
Right.
the only way that it's gonna change.
Right.
You know, and that's it's first off, it's just not even a realistic strategy. You know what I'm saying? It's just not even realistic. And secondly, it's just not true. You know?
Well, and there's you talked about this dynamic also in the book. Like a lot of these people that we're talking about are not going to hear it from people of color. They're actually going to hear it from white people.
I was just thinking about that as I was making that point. I'm glad that you brought us there because as I was thinking about it, it's like the thing that people underestimate when we think about, you know, black people trying to appeal to white people is that anti-blackness works in
Mm-hmm.
such a way
Right.
that when white people are listening to us, like they don't believe us.
Totally.
And in the book, I'm writing about people that I've known for a long time, people that I consider family, people who
Right.
know, you know, that I at least thought looked at me as an intelligent person, a trustworthy person, you know. And the people I called brother and sister, people I
Mm-hmm.
called father, you know,
Mm-hmm.
they
Mm-hmm.
didn't believe me.
No, they heard
And
it. They finally came around a little bit
yes, they
from
come back
hearing it
after
from white people.
after they hear from some other white person that they don't know, or some in some cases
Yes.
fictitious white people.
Yeah.
Then they're like, oh, well, you know, now I kind of believe you a little bit. Or
Yeah.
not I believe you, but a white person said the same thing that you said. And now I'm willing to concede
Yeah.
it because I heard it from a white person.
Yeah.
Right. And I experience that a lot. And so that's the funny thing to me. Funny thing to me is that when people tell me that all I have to do is speak nicely and reasonably to
Mm-hmm.
people and they'll listen to me, I'm
Mm-hmm.
like, have you ever tried it as a black person?
Yeah.
You can't. You're not black. You don't know how people
Right.
respond to me.
Right.
You know.
Well,
But
and you talked about this in the book too, that angry trope, right? Like
mm-hmm.
that you're not even allowed to express anger, which is a completely reasonable response to this.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. It is entirely reasonable, and that is a huge thing. Is like, you know, people, people's. I shouldn't say people, you know, but you know, my
Some
experience.
people.
You know, but my experience, you know, with white folks is the tone policing,
Yes.
right?
Talk about that.
Early on, you know, which
Yeah.
you know, I just don't really. I try not to get into this anymore with people. Like, if they're opposed, okay, they need to talk to somebody else. I try not to talk to
Yeah.
opposers, but early on, I did talk to a lot of opposers, and people were convinced that it's your tone.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
if you say it, if you come off angry, then people are just going to be turned off. Well, I mean, me being calm and rational didn't do much either. It just made it
Right.
easier for people to walk away.
Right.
And in the process, like I'm listening to the gaslighting nonsense, you know, and having to
Mm-hmm.
manage that
Mm-hmm.
mentally. So like tone doesn't matter when people are upset about the content. You
Right. That's
know,
right.
like I mean, in that sense, and you know, I do understand that there are some situations in life in which you can have a difficult discussion as long as you go about it a certain way.
Yeah.
But this does not seem to be one of them, you know,
Yeah.
because the point is not, again, it's not about the tone, it's that people just want you to shut up,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so for a long time, I didn't say anything because I didn't want to be interpreted as angry, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so early on in the book, you see me trying to very respectfully and very gently, you
Mm-hmm.
know, push back on the racist ideas or the anti-black ideas that were being expressed by the white friends that I couldn't keep.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't work.
Yeah.
You know,
You didn't.
it,
Yeah.
it didn't work. And so
Yeah.
that's the thing that I'm saying about the tone policing is that so many people are convinced that, you know, if you just say it the right way, then it'll work. Like, well, again, have you tried it as a black person?
Yeah.
You know?
Right. Yeah. Like, well, I
Yeah.
got a good response when I talked about systemic racism, so black people can just do it and get the same response.
Right, exactly. And that is what white people keep on underestimating, how they keep on underestimating the power of the color line, you know.
Yeah.
Because they think that because they had a conversation with someone and it didn't go so badly that it's going to go the same for me. You and I don't hold the same position in this society.
Right.
We're not perceived the same way. People don't assume the same things about us when we're talking. And just because somebody says I don't have a racist bone in my body or I don't even see color or whatever doesn't mean that that's true. I always I do
Never
say this
true.
sometimes when people are like, "Oh, I don't see color." I'm like, "Okay, so let's say the police I go missing and the police ask you to describe me real quick. What you gonna say?"
Uh-huh. Uh-huh. You
I
just
know
you didn't see that at all.
I know that you see color. I know you see color because you're looking at me and you can tell
No.
that I have brown skin, right? You just don't want to acknowledge the
Yeah.
significance of my complexion in this society. And
White people are obsessed with this idea.
oh
When
yeah.
when my kids were little, my boys, people loved to come tell me stories about how their child didn't notice they were black. But they would always be a story more of like how a kid didn't understand genetics, you know.
Mm-hmm.
But it's
Mm-hmm.
like you first of all, your kid does notice they're black. They're just not talking about it in this context. Second of all, like,
Right.
what is the impulse for you to come tell me this story? Like, why do I keep being told the same story by
Yeah.
various people?
Yeah. Yeah. I'm so colorblind that I want to tell you this story about your black children
Yes.
unprovoked, unsolicited,
Yes.
right? You know. So yeah, I mean, this is a way that this is just a way that a lot of people feel that they're going to be able to attack the race problem, and it's partly why I wanted to write this book. I've been wanting to write a book for a long time, because I've been on my own journey of understanding how does social progress really happen through people who don't have the resources, to they don't we're not resourced to fight against the armed regime of white supremacy.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
But there have been people who have done it in the past and they've seen some kind of change.
Mm-hmm.
So then if it happened before, it must be able to happen again. That's
Yeah.
what really provoked me to go on the journey that I've gone on to be able to write this book,
Yeah.
and that really is the thing that I want for people to walk away with is
Yeah.
all the practical insight about,
Yes.
social progress, about nonviolent struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Because the thing that people have been feeding us, that this is going to be solved by us just sitting down and listening to each other, as though there is this both sidesism where black
Right.
people have done just as much harm to white people as white people have done to black people.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's not going to work.
No.
All of this like tiptoeing around white people's feelings so that we don't offend them
Mm-hmm.
is just going to make our message unclear and make
Yeah.
the problem unclear.
Yeah, and I appreciated you talked about like white people who are grieved by what they're seeing in the news,
Yep.
particularly around police violence, but they're not grieved enough to make it urgent and radical.
Well, yeah, this is something Dr. King complained about when he
Mm-hmm.
said, the thing that people were responding to was they were appalled at the overt and virulent racist behavior of a Bull Connor or something like
Mm-hmm.
that.
Mm-hmm.
But they were not interested in genuine equality,
Yeah.
and they were not being provoked
Mm-hmm.
toward the kind of radical action that it would take to bring genuine equality about. And that is something that seems to still be a true assessment of much of white America. Although in the book I say I'm not really sure. I don't really know, because I can't read everybody's mind.
Mm-hmm.
But what I will say is I do believe that there are many people who are not interested in genuine equality. But I think what seems more obvious to me is that a lot of us still don't really understand the breadth of the
Mm-hmm.
problem, how resilient the problem is, how deeply entrenched the problem is, how systemic the problem is.
Yeah.
Because on the other side of me letting go of the white friends who wanted to stop me from participating in the movement for Black Lives
Mm-hmm.
are people that I met in the movement that meant well and were very passionate about
Mm-hmm.
being a part of, you know, protests and things like that, but
Mm-hmm.
were not receiving the re-education necessary
Yeah.
or the develop or the leadership investment that's
Mm-hmm.
necessary. I think I'm wording that weird, but I mean like people were not investing in building them up as leaders. There was no
Yes.
infrastructure to build them up as leaders.
Yes.
That they kind of just became like these really passionate but ill-informed participants
Yeah.
until they burn out, right?
Yes. That part felt really important to me. When I said, like, I think this is a book that, all white people who care about this should read, that part felt important, that it's, it's, it doesn't end with like, I care.
Right.
Then we need to do the personal work. Then we need to figure out how we're, supporting and not co-opting and not
Mm-hmm.
centering, and like
Right.
that just all felt really important to me. And
Right.
and I said this at the beginning, I just really appreciated, I felt like the book was such a wonderful balance of, there was, memoir aspects
Mm-hmm. For sure.
and your personal experience, but then you're, quoting all of these incredible voices, and you're really coming through this from like a praxis lens as well.
Mm-hmm.
I really loved it.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's really important to me to make a book that is readable,
Yes.
right? That is, and also
Yes.
digestible, you know. But I remember, you know, one of my friends mentioned in the earlier drafts of the book, they were like, "You just moved away from yourself so quickly," you know, in the writing, and I was like, "Yeah."
Yeah.
Yeah, because yes, I'm pulling you in, you know, to my story, and I think that my story is interesting, you know, in hindsight, you know, after writing it down, you know, I think it is an interesting story, but the book is so much bigger than that, right?
Yeah.
I hope that people walk away from this book with more than, you know, Andre has such an interesting story,
Right.
right?
Yeah.
I'm telling you the story uh, so that you know you get I'm telling the story on if I'm being really honest, I'm telling the story because most people aren't going to read the books that I've read, you know.
Totally.
Most people are not going to
Totally.
read the books that I've read. Most people are
Right.
not going to go on the journey that I went on. Most people
They're
are
not going to
not.
pick up James Baldwin.
Yeah, and they're not gonna. I mean, not even Baldwin. I'm talking about Erica Chenoweth, Serge Popovich, Gene Sharp, even Dr. King. A lot of people are not going to read Dr. King's books.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm. They're just going
they're
to
just
like the
gonna
sound
keep
bites. Yeah.
they're just going to keep quoting the color of the skin and not the context of the character. They're just going to keep doing that, you know,
Yeah.
but they're not going to actually read where do
Yeah.
we go from here, right?
Yes.
And they're not going to read Gandhi and Thoreau
Mm-hmm.
and, you know, all these different people.
Mm-hmm.
And so my experience in reading all this stuff and meeting them, like, you know, they're, you know, meeting some of these people, my experience was as I went on that journey, I just kept feeling like why doesn't everyone have this information?
Mm-hmm.
And it's because, you know, this is a social movement theory curriculum, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and the way that we think about these things in our consumer society is it's just all about interest, right? It's like a
Yeah.
hobby, right? So
Yeah.
like you read about changing the world because that's something you're passionate about and it interests you. And like
Yeah.
yeah, we forget like I did all this study to try to save my own life and the life of my nephews and nieces and
Mm-hmm.
my brothers and sisters and you know
Yeah.
my loved ones, right? So I know that that's how people think about this. You're not going to get this information unless
Mm-hmm.
you decide that you want to go get a sociology degree.
Yeah.
But we all need this information.
Yes.
So I want to write the book that I needed when I got started.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure that that book is readable, you
Yes.
know, because I could have just told everyone, go read Blueprint for Revolution by Sergei
Mm-hmm.
Popovich.
Yeah.
Right. And then you'll understand more about what actually needs to happen,
Yeah.
you know, for us to change the world. Or go read, you know, go read The Radical King, where Cornel West put Dr. King's writings together.
Mm-hmm.
I already have all these books in an Amazon store, you know, that people could buy. I've had it in there for years now,
Yeah.
you know. But the truth of the matter is, a lot of people just are not going to do that.
Yeah.
Well, I don't want this information to be locked away in the margins from people.
Yes.
So I made it my goal. I've made it my goal over the past several years to try to mainstream, you know,
Yeah.
just I want to mainstream this information. And so the book
Yeah.
is written in such a way that, yeah, I do want you to be drawn in by the story, and I want for you to go
Hmm.
along, and I want for you to experience these things alongside me. I want for your heart to break, when mine breaks in the book and all of that. But
Hmm.
really, what I want you to know is that it takes 3.5% of the that that no regime has been able to withstand the sustained nonviolent resistance of 3.5% of the population. And the only way that I'm going to get you this information is if I mix the medicine in with the orange juice.
Totally. I love it. I love it. I mean, it's funny because when I was writing my own book, I'm like, okay, we're going to market this as a mommy memoir, but then we're going to surprise them with a couple chapters on white privilege, but they'll have
Yeah,
no idea walking in.
yeah, yeah. Of course.
But
Yeah,
yeah, I mean, I relate to that so much because, right, like people aren't going to pick up these books unless they're already engaged, like
right.
these heavy theory praxis books unless they're already engaged. And
Mm-hmm.
I think you completely succeeded in that perfect mix of a memoir that captivated, and then you're like, and we're going to
Yeah,
quickly dart over here.
yeah. No, thank you. And a part of that is like what I said in chapter 3 is making that connection. Like, when we say that the personal is political, that
Yeah.
our personal lives are connected to these much larger political forces
Yeah.
and all this kind of stuff. Is for me to be telling you a story about I'm sitting at the lunch table with this all white family that I love, you know, and they're telling me that my personal experience can't be discussed at the table because it's politics. That's not apolitical, right? And
Right.
that's not separate from the socio-political context that we live in,
Yeah.
you know. And so to try to help connect the dots between the history, right? Is that like when you drive to the mall, that highway that you drive on might have cut right through a historically black neighborhood,
Hmm.
right? And it
Hmm.
might, right? And it might have driven thousands of people out of that area,
Hmm.
or, caused them to experience a level of poverty that they wouldn't have if it weren't built. Like that history is significant,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And we're not always making those connections. So,
Yeah.
that's partly why, I wanted to write the book that way. And I'm glad that it worked, because it was very hard to figure out
Yeah.
how to structure a book this way.
Yes.
Yeah.
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 Yeah. Well, I'm glad you did. I hope people will read it. Where and when can people find your book?
You can find it anywhere books are sold,
Yeah.
you know, and it's coming out March 22nd. So, really soon.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I will have it linked up in the caption of this as well. Where can people find you online if they want to follow you?
The best place is to go to my website. It's andrehenry.co, and I have
Awesome.
an email list there. We send out once a month about racial justice and social
Yes.
change and my music. Which is really how I got started in all of this. Is you know,
Yeah.
in the book very, very much is telling the story of how like I went from just kind of writing love songs to making my art more of a way to express myself about my experience as a black person in the world. So yeah, that's a great place, and I think all my social media is linked there as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would definitely encourage people to follow you on Twitter. I do. And I always appreciate your commentary there.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Andre. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having me.